Well, first off, we already know that Langston Hughes is one of the major poets of the Harlem Renaissance, major writers of the Harlem Renaissance. So we know he's a pretty important figure, not only in African American culture and in Harlem Renaissance culture, but really in modernist literature. And oftentimes, the Harlem Renaissance is seen as is very distinct from the modernist movement when it's really a major part of it. They're doing the same things. The only real difference is the matters of race. But in terms of technique, they're all playing with these ideas of experimentation and looking back into the past and seeing what you can salvage, seeing what doesn't work anymore, and seeing what can be refigured for a new era. Right. And some of the other things that we've already picked up about the modernists is they do like that ambiguity of meaning a lot, but they also like a multiplicity of voices. They like to hear different things going on at once. And more to the point, they like a kind of vague voice sometimes. You don't really know who's speaking. I've mentioned before Faulkner's famous novel, The Sound and the Fury, which is told in 4 chapters, and each one has a different perspective. The first chapter is told from the perspective of a person with severe learning disabilities, and it's not very clear what's going on to the average reader until you start to piece together all the clues, right? And for what it's worth, Faulkner writes quite a bit about race and race relations as well. But Langston Hughes then is really no stranger to any of these techniques. And like I said, he's a major figure in the Harlem Renaissance movement. And so we can see how he's playing with the past. We can see how he's wrestling with the past, both in the senses of the poetic traditions that are being reshaped, but also in the sense of the social order and the social structure of, the United States, right? So in addition to having to deal with what they feel is perhaps an outdated and outmoded forms of expression in the literature, he's also wrestling with the idea that this is really a culture that was foisted on him anyways, that that he's been kept both demanded to be a part of Main Street white culture, right? But also kept out of that Main Street white culture. Right. So the first thing I want to do before we get into my analysis of one of my favorite poems of all time, The Cat and the Saxophone by Langston Hughes, I want to start with how he has, like other modernists, worked with the past and how he's reaching back to one of the first big poets in American history, particularly as it leads into the modernist era, one that we already started with, and that's Walt Whitman. So before we go any further, let's take a listen to one of the poems we already read as a class, Walt Whitman's I Hear America Singing.
I hear America singing. I hear America singing, the varied carols I hear, those of mechanics, each one singing his as it should be, blithe and strong, the carpenter singing his as he measures his plank or beam, the mason singing his as he makes ready for work or leaves off work, the boatman singing what belongs to him in his boat, the deckhand singing on the steamboat deck, the shoemaker singing as he sits on his bench, the hatter singing as he stands, the woodcutter's song, the ploughboy's on his way in the morning, or at noon intermission, or at sundown, the delicious singing of the mother, or of the young wife at work, or of the girl sewing or washing, each singing what belongs to him or her and to none else, the day what belongs to the day. At night, the party of young fellows, robust, friendly, singing with open mouths their strong, melodious songs.
Okay. So we can get a lot of different ideas out of Walt Whitman. We've already discussed this a little bit. We know from our discussions of the romantics, but more importantly, the realists and the naturalists. We know that those authors and poets were trying to celebrate the common man, and we're definitely seeing that in Whitman's poetry as he talks about the carpenter and the laborers, and he refers to a lot of different common occupations, right? He's not talking about kings. He's not talking about really quote unquote important people. Let's put it a better way. He's not talking about the types of heroes that previous literature would have focused on. He's focusing more on the everyday experience. And we can see clearly how that's going to open the door for, a sort of empathy for other races, cultures, genders that we see an explosion of in modernism. As I've also mentioned in other essays and other lectures, modernism has its fair share of misogynists, sexist racism, lots of different isms, but it also has its fair share of very progressive-minded people, even if some of them slip along the way and aren't quite as progressive as they could have been. There's still a fair amount of that. I'm going to guess that Walt Whitman was pretty progressive for his time as well. At least that's generally the perception of him. So let's go ahead and listen to Langston Hughes's sort of rebuttal to I Hear America Singing, I Too.
I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful we are and be ashamed. I too am America.
Okay, so that's pretty interesting. One thing I want to notice, one thing I wanted to point out is that he says, and they will be near the end, you may have noticed that the lyrics, what Langston Hughes reads is not what he had written almost 25 years earlier. This recording is from 1955, and the poem was published in 1928. And he says, and they will see how beautiful I am in the original poem, but in this version, he says they will see how beautiful we are. And that makes it much more clear, much more obvious that he's not just talking about him and his own place in the poetic tradition. He's also talking about African-American culture and African-Americans in general, right? So when he says, I am the darker brother, he's talking about, obviously his relationship to the rest of mainstream American culture. And he really is trying to insist, and he is insisting, you know what, we're not actually outside the mainstream. We are the mainstream. We're just the darker brothers, and you've been keeping us away from the table. And when you see how good at poetry and at literature and everything that you value so much, when you see how well I can do it, you're going to be ashamed, and you're going to realize how beautiful I am and how beautiful all of us are, right? So he's talking about all of African-American cultures and all of African-American artists who have been excluded from these forms, either through systemic racism, outright personal racism, or just ignorance and a lack of empathy. Okay. So one thing I want to talk about too, though, is what I mentioned earlier, this problem when people look at the Harlem Renaissance and they focus entirely on black issues, right? They make it all about, every poem is about fighting oppression, and every poem is about the struggle, and not that those things should be ignored or made light of or dismissed in any way. That's certainly not my argument. However, it's a sort of ghetto to put a poet into a corner and say, yeah, well, he's a black poet, so he writes about black stuff, and that's, it's all about his place in culture and his place in white culture. Well, certainly everything he writes is going to have a certain tinge, right? It's going to have, it's him. It's going to have him in it. So, of course, it's going to be laced with some of those thoughts, and it's going to be focusing on the African-American experience, whether he really wants to talk about it in its relationship to the rest of America. I mean, he is African American, so that's going to be there. Nonetheless, It doesn't mean that all of his poems necessarily have to focus on the kind of darker side or the more gritty and painful side of the Black experience. Another thing to point out that I want to point out about the poem that we're going to hear next. First, let's go back to the Whitman poem. There we can see how Langston Hughes is not only responding to Whitman by saying, hey, you know what, I belong too. I just want to make this note. I know I backtracked quite a bit there. He's not just saying to Whitman, I belong too. He's also borrowing Whitman's form, that kind of, those long lines that that don't have a clear ending, that have all that enjambment, that free verse. Drew a blank there. That use of free verse that Whitman is so famous for, and that Ginsberg really runs with later. We'll read about him later too. Although honestly, I don't think he runs with it much further than Whitman already did. But Hughes is certainly using a lot of that free verse there. There's no real rhyme or structure to I too. He's using the same kind of things, as if to say, I too can do what you do, Mr. Whitman. Also, I want to note, Whitman doesn't ever mention any race in particular. So it's not like Hughes is necessarily calling out Whitman as saying, hey, you man, you didn't even talk about us. Whitman didn't say like my Irish brothers or my Italian brothers. He didn't call out any race in particular. So I don't think Hughes is necessarily saying to Whitman like, hey, you forgot us. I think he's saying to all of America, you forgot us. And you know, Whitman's celebration of the common man, if you were moved by that, you might also remember how many of us have been forced to be nothing but the common man, right? We're not allowed to have these positions of power that you may have celebrated before. So it's a sort of white privilege, if you will, to be able to celebrate the common man and to take a break from celebrating all the kings and queens, right? So there's not only the response to the poem, there's also the use of those poetic techniques. To be honest, that use of free verse has become so pervasive among 20th century poets that I don't really notice it anymore. It doesn't seem as experimental and original as it definitely was at that time. I'm not taking away from Hughes at all. But what I want to point out is that he's not just responding to Whitman in that voice. He's also very much in the mode of the modernists, which is to be very experimental, to use that multiplicity of voices. Let's go ahead. Oh, I wanted to point out one last thing. I did point it out. I want to go back and say one last thing about I too and his reading of it. And notice that he says we are, even though the original reading was I am. I mentioned this in a different lecture. If a poet wants to change the words, who am I to argue and tell him what the right lyrics are, the right words to the right? It's not lyrics. It's not a song. Who am I to tell him? No, the words are this. You got it wrong. Just like Wallace Stevens reading his 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, where he changes rhythms to rhymes when he reads it. That may have just been a slip that he went with. Here, I think Langston Hughes is intentionally saying we are instead of I am, because he wants to make it clear. He is talking about all of African-American artists, and really all African-Americans. So, before I get too ahead of myself, let's go ahead and take a listen to The Cat and the Saxophone.
The Cat and the Saxophone, 2 a.m. Everybody, half pint gin, no make it, loves my baby corn. You like liquor, don't you, honey? But my baby, sure, kiss me. Don't love nobody, daddy, but me. Say, everybody, yes, wants my baby. I'm your, but my baby, sweetie, ain't I? Don't want nobody, sure, but then let me do it, sweet me. Charleston, a mama.
Okay, so what I really like about The Cat and the Saxophone is, again, that multiplicity of voices that you see. It's so modernist and it's so experimental. And actually, the full title is The Cat and the Saxophone, 2 a.m. And that's pretty significant, right? So let's take this apart. It's The Cat and the Saxophone, 2 a.m. Now, he doesn't mean a cat like a kitty cat. He means, like the jazz term, a cool cat, right? A cool daddy-o. And it's The Cat and the Saxophone. So it's probably a dude blowing his horn on the stage, right? And it's 2 a.m. They're probably at a club. It seems to be that way. And I love this reading because this woman does a great job of singing the lyrics that are all in caps. You have that multiplicity of voices, right? Everybody loves my baby, but my baby don't love nobody but me. Everybody loves my baby, don't want nobody but me, sweet me. So that's one voice right there. That's the song. But then you have another voice. Half pint, gin. No, make it corn. You like liquor, don't you, honey? Sure. Kiss me, daddy. There's at least two voices going on there, right? There's the man talking to the woman at the bar. And then the third voice is the song that's weaving in and out as they talk, right? So there's three different voices happening. And it's not even really clear, at least when the man and the woman are talking, who is talking to whom, right? Who says half pint gin and who says no, make it corn. It's not exactly sure. You could probably figure it out. But that ambiguity is also, a modernist hallmark, right? So we have ambiguous voices, we have multiple voices, and we have this weird structure. I mean, what is this? There's no rhyme. There's no real rhythm. Everybody, half pint gin. It went down in syllables and it kind of climbs back up again, but even that's not a real pattern. I mean, it almost, because then, it just breaks later. It doesn't really keep any kind of consistent rhythm or pattern. But what is consistent is, like I said, this weaving in and out of the different voices. I like this poem because it, to me, paints a perfect picture of the club at 2 a.m. Imagine talking to someone you're chatting up or someone you were already with, and there's music in the background. I mean, how do you write that as a poem? You write it like this. You have the song weaving in and out of the conversation between the man and the woman. So again, I like to point this out for a number of reasons. One, I really like this poem. I love the way he puts it together, and I love the way he experiments with the visual form, right? This poem works well when you hear it, I think, but it really takes some skill. I mean, like I said, that's a really good reading that woman gives, but it really takes some skill to pull that off. I also really like it on the paper. I like the way it looks. For example, look at the bottom here. That's some straight E. Cummings kind of thing right there. That line is just an exclamation point. The very last line is just a piece of punctuation. And that was not going to fly even in Whitman's time. Whitman was going to be using that free verse. Whitman didn't do anything like this. This is advancing it even further, right? So it's yet again Langston Hughes proving that he belongs at the table. Last thing I will say about this one then is that, it's not only him showing how deserving he is, it's not bringing up any tragic element of the African-American experience, right? It's not focusing on what people expect, especially modern scholars and people who are not very well acquainted with the Harlem Renaissance. We tend to get introduced to things like, We Wear the Mask is earlier, but Incident and, other poems like that, or even I Too, which really focus on the trials and the tribulations of African Americans. But this is really just celebrating. This is not talking about any of that. It's just like celebrating life. There's nothing, and I'm not trying to dismiss or downplay the importance of those other poems. But as a poet, I'm sure he didn't want to be always having to approach the same subject matter. This is in no way avoiding his blackness. It's in no way of avoiding his culture, right? It's not the time. In this poem, it's just not the time to talk about some of the elements that he talks about in, say, a poem like I Too.